Well now, BookTube, it's early August and time for me to share my July reading. What were the highlights, lowlights, delights, disappointments, whatever. Now, this is going to be roughly half Jane Austen July sort of reading and half everything else that I read in July. So I'll stick in some timestamps so that you can jump around if you want to. Now, I finished 13 books in July. Well, actually, that's strictly speaking not true. I finished 12 and then the 13th sort of slipped over by about 36 hours into August, but we're going to pretend it didn't because it kind of belonged with my Jane Austen July reading. And I'm going to start by telling you what that one was. This Katie's new book, The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, and Katie as in Katie Lumsden of Books and Things. And this came out kind of halfway through July. It's her second novel. And I went to the book launch and, yeah, had to crack on and read it. And it fitted naturally with Jane Austen July because although this book is set in, I think it's 1841, so, 20 years after Austen herself died, it's got a kind of an Austen-y sort of feel to it, I guess. Well, not surprising, knowing Katie Austen, but also Elizabeth Gaskell, Anthony Trollope. Think the novels that they wrote that are set in like a market town, a small country town, a large village, things like Emma, things like Trollope's Dr. Thorne, Gaskell's Cranford, that sort of thing. That's the sort of feeling of this book. Absolutely delightful. Tilly and I have both read it and we're going to record a discussion video soon and stick that up, so I will say no more, but yeah, run out and get it and share the pleasure of Katie's book. There you go. So that was my sort of last Jane Austen July bit of reading. But what about the rest? So obviously every Jane Austen July you have to reread one of the, or read for the first time if you're not, a Jane Austen obsessive like me, one of the main novels. And this year for me it was Mansfield Park. Now that was brilliant for me, and because it was a reread, a sort of multiple reread, I actually, although I'm waving a physical copy here, I read it as an audiobook, which is something that's really enjoyable for a reread. And I don't have that problem with a reread of feeling like, oh, that other person's kind of putting the voice of the book into my head. I've already got the voice for the book and I can enjoy someone else's interpretation. I would say Mansfield Park is an Austen novel for Austen connoisseurs. It's not the Austen to start with if you're not already an Austen reader, an Austen fan. Start with Pride and Prejudice or Emma or Sense and Sensibility or whatever. Don't start with this. But what a wonderful novel it is. So why do I say don't start with it? Because it doesn't have the sort of romantic plot that you get in Pride and Prejudice or Persuasion, say, or that kind of very, plot-driven fun of Northanger Abbey. It's a different feel of book. It has one of those sort of witty Elizabeth Bennet, Emma Woodhouse sort of characters in it, but she's not the heroine. The heroine of Mansfield Park, Fanny, is shy and a bit reserved and kind of thoughtful person, but not a sparkling Lizzie Bennet or not even an Eleanor Dashwood. What she does have, though, is deep inner reserves of strength and one might call it moral fibre, if you know what I mean. That's Fanny. She's not a weak person. She might seem it, but actually she's strong and she knows what she thinks. And it's a book about, the value of having a sense of sort of duty and trying to live and act decently and do right by people. Yeah, it's also about family. It's also about class. Yeah, really, really interesting novel. Now, if that all sounds a bit sort of dreary in a way, it's not. It's actually one of Austen's funniest books, I think, although people don't always immediately spot that. Now, Tilly and I made a video for this Jane Austen July about humour in Austen, and I pick out a few things from Mansfield Park for that. But yeah, if you haven't read Mansfield Park yet, but you've read a few Austen, go for it, enjoy it, but just don't expect it to be Pride and Prejudice. It's a different feel of book. Yeah. Well, now, thinking about humour in Jane Austen, one of the things that sometimes takes people by surprise when they read her juvenilia, her minor works that she wrote as a teenager and a young adult woman before she wrote the novels, or while she was sort of polishing her skills, people are sometimes surprised because the humour in this is even more extreme and kind of almost cruder, more farcical, quite rude at times. And yeah, it's a different side of Austen that you kind of perhaps wouldn't suspect from her mature novels. I read the last sort of volume 3 of her juvenilia this year, and that included Evelyn and Catharine and her, but also her poems and prayers. Interesting, great to have completed that. So, my non-fiction for Jane Austen July was The Genius of Jane Austen by Paula Byrne. And what Byrne does in that is she analyses Jane Austen's exposure to drama, whether reading it or family theatrical performances or going to the professional theatre, all of which she did, and looks at how it shaped her writing, and including her humour, in fact, which it definitely did. It's an interesting book. I'd say it's not as good as the real Jane Austen, A Life in Small Things, which is the other Paula Byrne Jane Austen book I've read. That's brilliant. I enjoy The Genius of Jane Austen, but you kind of need to be a bit obsessed, I think, with Austen to enjoy it a lot. You've got to be interested in the sort of minutiae of she must have been to see this play, or when she went to see that, this was her opinion of this actor or this actress, and that sort of then breaking that down into, she uses this dramatic device in her writing, or she uses, and it's true she does, she uses dialogue that's almost like a play script at times to reveal character or to move a plot along, or do sort of significant plot reveals. All true, all fascinating, but it's not, wouldn't be the first sort of non-fiction about Jane Austen's writing that, or her life, that I'd recommend to people. It's more niche, shall we say. I extended my sort of thinking about this, though, this Jane Austen July, by reading 2 plays by Hannah Cowley. Now, Hannah Cowley was a woman playwright who was, in fact, one of the most popular playwrights of Jane Austen's period. Her plays were on a sort of regular rotation, some of them in Bath and London, and for theatres around the country. And I read Who's the Dupe from 1776 and The Belle Stratagem from 1780, and both plays that we know Austen knew and saw. How did I find them? They were witty, they were entertaining. I really enjoyed reading them. They were quick reads. They have the kind of lively, strong-minded women characters that you see in Austen. As I say, the Emma Woodhouse, Lizzie Bennet, Miss Crawford kind of figures. They have that kind of preoccupation with marriage, needing to make the right marriage. Do you get to marry for love? That you see frequently in Austen. I wouldn't say that Austen got that from Cowley. It was just, that was the reality of of life then, and you know, women's lives in particular, I suppose. So any woman writer was maybe going to home in on that as a topic. The Belle Stratagem, though, definitely has hints of Pride and Prejudice plot in it. That thing of first impressions, sort of almost mistaken first impressions about someone, and you know, that are unfair and inaccurate, and then can you get beyond them to form a relationship or marry? I mean, I suppose the conclusion I came to from my reading is that, you know, Jane Austen, she definitely uses misunderstandings and coincidences and kind of some, I don't know, quite melodramatically exaggerated characters that you can kind of see as coming, maybe inspired from her experience of drama and plays. But what Austen does is she makes them feel like real life. You know, in her novels, even if, I don't know, unusual or slightly surprising things happen, you always feel like they could have happened. You know, you could meet that person, that they could have done that thing. And that's Austen's great strength, isn't it? And, you know, her characters, it feels like they have a past and they will have a future. Yeah, so that's my reflection, I suppose. But if you were going to read the Belle Stratagem, you can see why that's the one that's had sort of recent revivals. Now, the cat is trying to escape from the room right now. I'm hoping... Looky, come over here. That's it. Stop trying. Yeah, that's better. You can jump on my lap if you like, but stop scrabbling at the door. Okay, so now, that was my Jane Austen July reading. Really rewarding, delightful, as ever. I love it. What else did I read in July? Quite a bit. Now, I will save for last the best thing I read that wasn't for Jane Austen July in the month. And I'm going to start with the two things that I read for the BookTube prize. And those were The Reformatory by Tannarive and Wellness by Nathan Hill. Now, they were both really decent novels. I was happy that The Reformatory didn't go forward from my semi-final group into the final, and reasonably content that Wellness did. The Reformatory is it's kind of quite a heartfelt, passionate novel in how it's written, but it just didn't quite work for me, particularly the horror element of the plot. So Wellness really surprised me by being, it's sort of, Catty, come this way, that's it, by being, it's kind of like a state of the nation, big American novel of ideas, you know, and I wasn't sure that that would work for me, but it did, and Hill managed to really engage me. So yeah, a surprise hit, I suppose. I've made a roundup ranking video of the 6 books that I read for that semi-final, so I won't say any more about either of those. I'll link to it instead. So, what else did I read? Well, I read 3 non-fiction books, and number 1 of these, I'm going to have to pause and rescue this cat. Okay, I should pause a second. Okay, cat's out of the room. Of course, do you know what he'll do now? He'll now start scrabbling to come back in, because that's cats, isn't it? But we're not here to talk about cats, we're here to talk about books. So, 3 non-fiction. First up, a graphic memoir, Factory Summers by Guy Delisle. He's a French-Canadian comic artist, writer. It's translated from the French by Helge Dascher and Rob Aspinall. It's about when he was a teenager and a student and spent his summers working in a paper mill in Quebec City. And it's that thing where he's just visiting almost, you know, working there for the summer, and they accept him and he's part of you know, the working life there. But he's reflecting, I guess, on what it's like for the men that spend their whole working lives. And I say men advisedly, there's no women in the book. Who spend their whole working lives working in that kind of environment. And it's quite poignant and touching and thoughtful and reflective. A goodie, I would say. Next up, for non-fiction, I read, okay, wait for it, Hypnobirthing, Practical Ways to Make Your Birth Better. Okay, why was I reading that? For the same reason that I read Give Birth Like a Feminist last month. It's because it's to bring myself up to speed to be helpful to Tilly with her sort of late pregnancy, birth and so on. And I've actually found it a really interesting experience because it's quite intriguing to see what's the same and what's changed in the sort of 3 decades since I was doing like birth and pregnancy. And what's nice is I think things have become lots is the same, but there's a much sort of better evidence base now, I suppose. And this book, the Siobhan Miller book, I thought like this is the book that I would have liked to have had and read when I was doing this myself, and what a shame it wasn't around then, and I'm really glad it is around now. There you go. Then, third non-fiction that wasn't Jane Austen July related was this one, A Time in Rome by Elizabeth Byrne. Now, I've been doing over the last couple of months with a group of people a bit of a Bowen deep dive, and this was the one non-fiction book that we read as part of that. And it's based on an extended visit she made to Rome at the very end of the 1950s. So that sort of, as Rome was sort of recovering from World War II and so on. It's an unusual book. I really liked it, but I don't think it would work for everybody. It's kind of like this weird hybrid between being a bit of an informal guidebook with a kind of dipping into history and ancient history, art history, political history, and personal experiences, personal impressions of Bowen. Now, it's written in Bowen's usual, absolutely gorgeous, beautifully wrought sentences. And she goes off on some really interesting sort of diversions, digressions, I don't know, like, this section comparing the Empress Livia, the Emperor Augustus's wife, and the Empress Josephine, Napoleon's wife, for example. I think it's a book you should only read if you're a Bowen, if you've got a taste for Bowen and you're interested to see how she writes non-fiction, and you've been to Rome or you're going to Rome, and so you can kind of picture a bit what she's talking about. There you go. The other Elizabeth Byrne that I read in July was her selected stories. Now, this is a selection of her short stories from beginning of her career in the 1920s through to the sort of post-war period. And it's very, very unusual for me to read a whole volume of short stories, okay? It's not something I do. I only did it because I was doing this sort of Bowen deep dive exercise. And so it was not my favourite read of the Bowen sort of thing, nor my favourite read of the month by any means. But if you are a short story enthusiast, then I would say do read Byrne short stories. She is absolutely, mistress of the form. Some of them were really brilliant, and even a non-short story reader like me really, got a lot out of them. I would say read this selected stories, which are chosen and introduced by the writer Tessa Hadley. And don't read her collected short stories, as in all of them, because, read the selection that's the best. I've heard, I think Sean Breathe's books sort of embarked on reading the collected ones, and, variable quality, whereas all of these were good. So that leaves me to tell you about what was my highlight and best book of the month that wasn't Jane Austen related, okay? And that was, strangely enough, also a collection of stories, but the kind of interlinked story that you put together and makes a novel, makes a coherent whole. And I really enjoyed that, unlike sort of short stories in themselves. And that was Marzahn, Mon Amour by Katja Oskamp, translated from the German by Joe Heinrich. Now, how can I explain how lovely this book was? Well, the narrator is having a bit of a midlife, not exactly crisis, but kind of, you know, she's a writer, her career's kind of in the doldrums, she's not sure what she's doing with her life. I mean, I think her personal life is okay, but, you know, work terms, she's feeling a bit lost. And what she does is she decides to retrain as it's called a chiropodist in the novel, but actually I think it's more of a pedicurist. You know, she doesn't do the full 3-year kind of scientific degree type course you need to do to be a qualified chiropodist. But you know, it's a hands-on, thorough training, and she then starts working in a salon, and this salon is in Marzahn, which is like a big housing estate area in Berlin, but what was in the East German part of Berlin. And she has all these customers, these regular customers, and as she's sorting out their feet, they're awful, you know, we get the descriptions of the feet, but we get, you know, obviously they sit there and they talk to her, and she sort of draws it out of them, and they tell her about her lives, their memories, their joys, their sorrows, their you know, and you put that together and you get this picture of this community, you know, the quirky characters and the sad characters and the resilience of some of them, and you get a lot about how sort of that sort of unification, you know, the East German, West German, you know, how they came together, what it was like for the former East Germans when that happened. You get bits of the narrator's life as well. You get to see how that job and that experience of talking to these people somehow brings her some peace and satisfaction in her life. And it's a really warm-hearted book, and I don't read uplit as a rule, and it isn't. It's got its dark moments, I suppose, and it's ultimately a book that leaves you feeling, I don't know, positive about humanity and human nature and people, and it's quite funny and touching, and yeah, all round a good thing. So if you haven't yet chosen something for Women in Translation Month in August, give Marzahn Mon Amour a thought. It's a wholehearted recommendation from me. There we go. So that was my July, the Jane Austen bit and the non-Jane Austen bit. Tell me if you've read any of these things, if you agree or disagree with my opinion. And what was the highlight of your July reading? I always like to know that too. And now roll on August.